So they got the rights to Pokemon outside of Asia, and they got this really talented team of writers and producers together, and they really rewrote and reimagined that show for kids in the US because there's cultural differences, there's storytelling differences, there's standards and practices differences. And they created this production model for how do you adapt a fully animated, finished Japanese show in English with new music, new voices, even some new storylines because you can manipulate story in your writing and editing. And we all know, became huge. So 4Kids was like, all right, we're going to take this model and do it with more stuff. And Yu-Gi-Oh was one of the next things that they did as they were like flooded with Pokemon money. And like, they're like, we got to expand and expand fast. So they went from a team of like 5 people to a team of like 100 people in a matter of a couple of years. And I got in just at the beginning of that when they were, Pokemon was a hit. Yu-Gi-Oh was already bought by Kids WB, and I came in while they were starting to make that first season of Yu-Gi-Oh. And I didn't come in until season 2 of Yu-Gi-Oh. So I was working on a show called Ultraman Tiga for them at first, and I was like a writer producer. But then the guy who was the writer producer of season 1 of Yu-Gi-Oh went on to make Ninja Turtles, the 4Kids version of Ninja Turtles. So I got season 2 and beyond of Yu-Gi-Oh. So I did seasons 2 through 5 of the original Yu-Gi-Oh with that cast of, Seto Kaiba and probably all the ones you watched. And then I did the first couple seasons of Yu-Gi-Oh GX, which was like the very first spinoff. And again, this was a time where I had never written for long form. I still didn't consider myself a writer. It's early-ish in my career, early 2000s. But the first step in this job, it was 90% writing because we got the show from Japan. So we would get a season of the show from Japan, see what they did, and then we'd have to figure out what were we going to do to make the story maybe a little simpler, a little more accessible to kids. Oh God, we can't have that death storyline in there. We can't have those knives in there and those guns. So we had to do all that stuff and create new music and do casting for voices and all that stuff and do a lot of rewriting. And it was a really weird writing process because you had to match the lip flap of the animation because that was done. There was no new animating. So you would sit there and not only did you have to write, of course you had their story as a guideline, but you really needed to use those writing techniques that, is signature in storytelling, in the US and other countries too, where there's an inciting incident and there's a problem to overcome and then there's a payoff at the end. A lot of that didn't always exist in the Japanese version of the show. So it involved, knowing storytelling and also like writing a line of dialogue. And then you'd have to play back the video and perform it and see if it fit in the mouth. And you'd be like, oh, that was 3 syllables too long. I have to change this word. And then you'd perform it again. And when I started, it was literally a VHS tape on with a remote control. Because this is like, really early days. There weren't digital videos yet. Then eventually we had QuickTimes and whatever. But that was the process so I was the head writer and the series producer of Yu-Gi-Oh for all of those seasons. And I wrote, like 250 episodes or something. It was crazy volume of stuff.
That is crazy. That is so crazy. You really shaped so many childhoods. I mean, that's like, is there something that's uniquely maybe difficult? Like you already gave some examples with like the lip flap and stuff, but I just curious about the difference between like the rhythms of Japanese storytelling versus Western storytelling. Like, did you have to change big story arcs? Was it kind of generally the same story? Like Yu-Gi-Oh had definitely some complexity to it.
Yeah.
And you already talked about like simplifying some things. Like
Mhm.
what was the main, I guess, challenge? And then what was the thing you were most proud of?
So on like a technical level, they do a lot of internal dialogue in their stuff. There's like minutes can go by and you're just hearing the thoughts inside a character's head. So when two characters were having a duel and they were yelling back and forth at each other. And it was kind of like wrestling. There was like a game, a fight going on where there was a winner and there were points and there was I'm winning, you're winning, my points are this, your points are this. But there was also an emotional story going on between those characters. So some of their dialogue was the gameplay, and some of their dialogue was the story. And when it came to the story, I think we added a lot to that. I think in the Japanese version, sometimes it was got a little more technical or a little too deep in their internal thoughts. So we would do things like when we were on the face of one character, when the camera was on one character, and in the Japanese version, he's thinking and thinking and thinking, we might have the other character talking off screen and finishing what they were saying before. So it was more of a back and forth conversation and less of a internal dialogue doing the exposition. So that's like one example. There were some where we had to change the villain's motive completely because his motive was to kill Yugi. You couldn't do that, on Kids WB for 8-year-olds. So we had to change what his goal was. And that was something that had to be reinforced in dialogue throughout the whole season. And it wasn't death. And we kind of leaned into this thing called the Shadow Realm, which you might remember,
Mhm.
which was actually a very small piece of season 1 of Yu Gi Oh! That I think might have come from the Japanese version, where Pegasus, the villain of season 1, had had trapped someone in the Shadow Realm, which was this other dimension. And we started to use that for death in all of the other seasons. So it was like, if you lose this duel in the Japanese version, that razor blade is going to cut your head off. In ours, that was a dark energy disc. And if it touches you, you get banished to the Shadow Realm.
Mm.
So we had to add that world to it. And we had a whole graphics and art team that would sometimes create Shadow Realm graphics. So there was like purple smoke where there wasn't before. So a lot of that kind of stuff too in the storytelling.
Wow. So you did have the ability to make some visual changes to the show.
Yes. And we had to because we had to put more clothing on a lot of the female characters and we had to turn guns into lollipops and that kind of stuff. And we were able to add some story elements as well. Yeah, there was a really talented art team that was able to do that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of writing exercise to have the finished product and to like sort of make a new version of that that's like better for Western audiences and also like you're saying, changes some of the more violent aspects of it into a more approachable thing for kids. And it just seems like did you have a team of writers or was it like just you? Like how did it work? Because it seems like so many episodes and so much storylines. Like there's no way you could have done that all by yourself.
It was crazy. It was a lot of free there. We worked with a lot of freelance writers. There were not a ton of staff writers. There were a few, but also the volume was so high. Like we had to make 2 shows a week, write 2 shows a week, record 2 shows a week. So a much more aggressive schedule than you would have in a typical animated show where you have weeks and weeks. Obviously, you're writing from scratch, so it's a different process. But the volume was so high that we had to have multiple writers writing at the same time. And it was a serialized show. So you might be writing episodes 2, 7, 11, and 15, and you don't know what happened in between those. So the only person who had the whole season in their head was the head writer. So in many ways, a lot of my job was like having meetings where I had to just like catch writers up on where they were in the process and the storyline. And then I did, because I was young and there also wasn't a lot of time, I would usually just get a first draft from a writer. Like I needed just that little head start. And then I would actually take it from there. And sometimes, depending on the skill of the writer, it was like a 90% rewrite, and sometimes it wasn't. So that is where my writing chops really got honed because I could only have done this when I was in my 20s. I could not do that show today, but I would pull all-nighters several times a week and be writing all night long.